Hi, this is Ellie Fishman, and welcome to our latest CTisus Facebook Live. And welcome. And we're trying to figure out a topic for today's session. And again, I will say to you that if anyone has any ideas for topics, let me know and we'll do them. And let me fix my tie. I feel like Rodney Dangerfield. But I picked this one. We were trying to think of what to do, and I just said, okay, let's do coronary CTA. And the question I actually have is more a question for you, so perhaps people can answer. And the question is, are you doing cardiac CTA in your practice? And if you're doing it as an outpatient basis or an inpatient basis? Are you doing it 24/7 or are you doing it 8 to 5? And let me just go back what kind of made me come up with that question. When we do CME courses, one of the things I've noticed is that if I ask the question to an audience of general radiologists and I say, how many of you do a cardiac CTA? Probably about 10% of people raise their hands. Now, if I say, how many of you are doing virtual colonoscopy? About 10% of people raise their hands, maybe less than 10% of people. So I was thinking, it's interesting that one of the things we have in radiology is lots of new technology, and cardiac CT is more than a decade old, so it's been reimbursed for decades. So it's not really new technology by any means. But the question is, why don't people do it? And so I thought maybe we could talk about that and what would it take to change that. So perhaps, again, people can ask questions or make comments, and I could see all the comments, like from someone signing in from Colombia and a few other places. But so what is the issue with cardiac CT? So let's think about the logical thing. The first thing is you need to have a good scanner. So you need to have I won't say a top-of-the-line scanner. The faster your scanner, the easier it is to do cardiac. But you're having a good 64-slice scanner, which is the minimum. But many people have 128s or similar scanners, and so it's really doable. And surely if you do beta blockers, you can get really do well with most scanners, but why don't people do it? So one thing is, of course, is the issue about reimbursement. And reimbursement is not great for cardiac CT, but it's getting better, or it's gotten better, and it's okay. One of the things, of course, is doing the study. So once you have the technology, the question is, how do you do the study? Remember, it's a fast injection, well-timed acquisition, gated study, and then you need to do post-processing. Now, each part of that question actually has gotten easier. The scanners are much easier to get a quality study, where before maybe it was 70%, now it's probably 95+% of the time. And then the post-processing, whether you have Siemens or GE or Philips or anybody else, or like a Terra Recon, the software for doing the reconstructions is a lot easier to do. It's fairly automated. Some of the scanners actually do the whole post-processing for you, and you just simply need to check it and read the study. So I think that the technology involved is getting easier. It's getting faster and more reliable. So I'm not really sure what the issue is, perhaps. Now, you could say as well, what are you offering in terms of availability? So let's take an outpatient center, and we'll take our outpatient centers. Well, the fact is most of our centers are open from 7:30 to 5 or 5:30, and anytime during the day we'll do a cardiac CT or calcium score. We do lots of calcium scores because I may have mentioned this before, that a lot of the internists now feel that calcium scoring is an important part of when they're evaluating patients as part of a physical. And they want a baseline, just like they get cholesterol. And calcium scoring is not something you do every year, but surely a baseline. People will say age 50, some people say age 45. It's a good thing to get because it's another risk factor measurement and something you can do to really plan whether or not how you're going to treat the patient. So we could say that's an easy thing, but we do the coronaries. And of course, if you think about coronaries in an outpatient setting, if a patient has severe chest pain, they go into the ER. You're not doing it in the outpatient center. If someone has a history, there's vague pain, a number of different processes. You can imagine we do it in the outpatient center because it's not a urgent study. We read them urgently. We read all our scans within, let's say, a half an hour, and if need even less than that. But again, it becomes the process of how you do things, so that becomes very, very important. So that's an outpatient setting, and perhaps maybe your outpatient centers are open longer. That would make some sense. You could do it a little bit later. But what about in the hospital? So that's really where the challenge comes in. So places that offer cardiac CT, if I speak to people, often they'll do it 8 to 5, Monday to Friday. That's kind of a challenge because if you're trying to build it into the ER proper, then how do you block out Saturdays and Sundays? So now let's say you move it to 8 to 5 Saturday and Sunday. So first of all, you need a good scanner in the ER. Second of all, you need to make certain all your techs are well trained. Remember, in our situation, not every tech is cardiac trained. The ones that are cardiac experts, we have them get certification. So again, you need to make certain that you have the right technologists in the right place and make sure that you go all out to make sure your cardiac techs are really well trained and they do enough studies. That's one thing. But then in the hospital, what is it you do? Now, I will tell you, we do 7 days a week till 7 p.m. Now, you can argue, why don't we do it 24/7? I don't think it's a technologist issue. We have enough technologists, and the ones we have at night are really terrific, and they can do the cardiacs. The issue is more the bandwidth of the physicians because we all need to be on call doing the cardiacs, and we take the call at the weekends and nights, but again, we've been doing to 7 o'clock. People do ask me to do longer, but it's not been a whole lot of asking. I think it's more the fact that people, whatever you do, will ask you to do more. But I think if they pushed us, we probably would go to 9 or 10 or 11 o'clock at night. We're in-house till 11 o'clock anyway. But the question is this something you need to do? But I think you probably do need to make certain you offer it in your practice. And again, it seems to us that 7:30 to 7 works well. I have spoken to some people, and not many, who have 24/7, but then I ask them how often they do it, and they often will say they do it like once a week. Then some places do it like overnight, but it's not read to the morning. And I guess we had that option, and people have asked me that, could we just do the studies and you read them in the morning? Conceptually, that works fine for a lot of things, but I would hate to have a cardiac CT done at midnight that's positive. I don't read until 7:30. That could be problematic from a legal perspective. So it's a little bit challenging how to do things. Now, I do know the reimbursements are okay. They're not great. It's easier to read non-contrast chest CTs or just routine positive chest CTs or a PE study than a coronary study. All that extra work on the post-processing side, all that extra work on the radiologist analysis of those images or perhaps generating those images really is not reimbursed to where it needs to be. And I think this is the same thing with colon. For colon, you need to get a pump, you need to take longer doing the studies, you need supine, prone, you need to analyze the studies 10 to 15 minutes, and nobody wants to do it. The reimbursements are not very good, and so there's not been a big interest with colon. Also, the reality is with colon, the biggest challenge is, in some sense, getting patients in most centers because who refers your patients? The GI doc. How does a GI doc make money? They do colonoscopy. So you're asking someone to send you patients where they could do it themselves. They send you patients when the patients failed colonoscopy or when they are so debilitated they don't want to do colonoscopy on them, or perhaps they can't pay. So that's really one of the issues. Now with the cardiac, you can argue the cardiologists want to do caths, but I think everyone's shown that 2/3 of caths are necessary, they're negative, and CT is a good gatekeeper for triaging patients to cath. And I think most cardiologists, most places do understand that, so I think they would probably be reasonably happy to do cardiac CT, particularly in the middle of the night, and then triage patients from there. The question is, how do you build up that practice? I think, remember the old days when cardiac CT was first coming along, there was a big fight between radiology and cardiology who would do it. It still varies in different places. Some places cardiology and radiology does it on separate scanners or at different times. Some places they share the work. Some places only cardiology. Some places only radiology. So I won't go into what the best model is and what you should do, But I think you really do need to consider, if you're not doing it, perhaps at least start with that 8 to 5 service. I think perhaps speak to your referring docs from the internal medicine side, from the ER side, and from the cardiac side, and see if they're interested in referring patients. Is there something you could build up? There's lots of literature, a lot of it's on CTisus, showing the really good results with cardiac CTA. So it's something to really learn. And it's something to really provide as a really good service. So I'm looking at the comments. Someone said calcium scores are often too high. Just a point that I spoke about this before in one of our lectures, that most people will say with a score above 1,000, you probably don't want to do a cardiac CT because it's hard to get a negative study, because often the vessels have so much calcium in part that you can't really clear them for being widely patent. So that's a little bit of a challenge, but I think that's not too much of a problem in our experience. Someone mentions when they were at Duke, they had a dual energy scanner. You don't need a dual energy scanner to do cardiac CT. There was thought with dual energy to subtract calcium, but coronary vessels are so small, you tend to subtract too much calcium and you give the patient stenosis that aren't there. So dual energy really hasn't taken off in terms of cardiac. There's some work, Stefan Zimmerman and Hopkins, other people have used dual energy as a way of looking at the myocardium, perhaps looking at ischemia or infarction. So there is some value to dual energy, but it's not going to be specifically on the coronary arteries. Again, let me just go back to people's comments. And again, maybe it's a good time if people could perhaps tell me why they're not doing cardiac CT in their practice, or why they are, and what hours they're doing. That might be something worthwhile. So I don't know if all of you can see the questions. I know I can. And if you can't see them when you're watching this or listening, you can go back to Facebook later on, and it does list all of the comments actually in sequence. So that'll be important. Another question, just in terms of practical aspects, is who does the post-processing on the cardiac CTAs? So I think all of us are trained to do it ourselves, but I think from an efficiency perspective, it's probably very good if you train those cardiac technologists to do it. The process is much faster than it used to be. It takes only a couple minutes. And particularly if you're remote, it's much easier if people push the images to you, then you can just go in and look at the studies. So that becomes very important. Now, Brittany Johnson said we run into patients with elevated heart rate, so the cardiac study is contraindicated. That's not really true. If you have an elevated heart rate, and I'm not sure what number you're talking about, an elevated heart rate, but just give beta blockers. One thing for sure is with the fast scanners, you probably can do a heart rate without beta blockers into 85, 90. But the other thing beta blockers do, besides dropping the heart rate, is it smoothens out the rhythm. So even with a fast scanner, beta blockers are only going to help you. Christy Lynn from Robert Wood Johnson. I was visiting professor up there a while back, haven't been there in a while. I know there's some people from my high school class were radiologists in that group, and there was someone named Richard Feinstein, I think he's retired from Hopkins, who was part of that Robert Wood Johnson for a very long time. But I think, again, this idea about heart rate is just one good example. Is you got to figure out what's limiting your practice, and then trying to figure out how to get around some of those problems. Angel makes the point that she's in a small hospital now, and I think that's one of the issues. In a small hospital, I think it's not the size of the hospital, but it's the size of the scanner. So if you have a 64 slice, cardiac CT is so-so. If it's less than that, it's probably just not going to happen. So I think you need to be practical. It is something people do think about when they buy scanners. Is it worthwhile buying a better scanner to do cardiac? But of course, it's a chicken and egg. If you don't have business, then it's not worth buying the scanner. And if you buy the scanner and if you don't have business, it's costing you a lot of money. A really, really good scanner for cardiac is going to be $1.5 to $2 million. Praline asked the question, what about patients with arrhythmia? It's hard to stabilize with beta blockers. Arrhythmias are always tricky, but we do have some software now that allows us to scan patients with arrhythmias and get quality studies. So You might want to speak to your app specialist, whether it's Siemens, GE, or Philips, and ask them how to deal with patients with arrhythmias. With the newer scanners, you can do very, very well. Monique says beta blockers, good contrast and gating make for excellent post-processing parameters. Absolutely. If you have crappy data set, if there's motion, if the injection is poor, the vessels are not well opacified, the post-processing is painful because it's kind of a garbage in, garbage out philosophy. If you have really good vessels and surely if the patient is normal, very easy, it looks like in the textbooks. Well-defined vessels, nice opacification, everything looks great. So anyway, I think just as maybe to encourage people who are not doing cardiac CT, take a look at it, read some articles, look at your technology, think about it when you're buying your next scanner, look at what your scanner can do, and perhaps adjust accordingly. So it looks like my time is up. I appreciate everybody's attention and comments, and if you have more comments, just write them down, and I'll try to get to them. And with that, I wish you a great Tuesday. See you later.